Welcome to the IP2 Podcast. I'm Shea Ashby, and as always, I'm joined by Felix Chung. We are lucky to have Bill Lapage from the Spike Feeders joining us today.
Bill is a member of the Spike Feeders and its flesh and blood related offshoot, Spike Feeders FAB. Bill is also one-third of the award-winning Living Legends podcast. He is also our neighbor on the Canadian prairies from Winnipeg. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you both for having me. I'm really excited to have a chance to chat with you both today.
Yeah, we're super excited to have you. So we like to always start our interviews off with the old elevator pitch. So can you give us a little lowdown on yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I have been playing card games for basically as long as I can remember. It started with my brother back in the early 2000s and me looking at a lot of his Magic cards that he had from around like Tempest era. And ever since then, I've just been interested in most of the big card games. Played Yu-Gi-Oh! Back when I was in like early high school. Transitioned to Magic after that. Played that for quite a while. And then as I sort of became disillusioned with that, I picked up Flesh and Blood and just kind of been rolling with it ever since. In my like real life, in my day-to-day, I'm a commercial insurance underwriter. So I work with sort of if somebody needs insurance for their business or for their building that they own, then sort of that's my jam. It's just about as interesting as it sounds.
Yeah.
And outside of that, in addition to card games, I've been into video games my whole life as well. Started with the N64 and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater on the blue cartridge.
Thanks.
Yeah, big fan of that sort of stuff. And yeah, like lots of different RPG style games. Diablo 2 was a big love of mine back in the day. And now it's sort of mostly roguelikes when I have a chance to play them. So things like Slay the Spire, Backpack Hero, Hades. Yeah, so that's sort of the lowdown on me as a person, as a gamer.
Nice, that's awesome. Have you picked up Diablo 4 since it came out, or are you past that?
No, I have. I spent a lot of time with Diablo 3. I was actually at Diablo 3 from the beginning. So Diablo 3 Vanilla with the Act 2
house.
Wasps. Yeah, the auction house. Yeah, that was a travesty. But yeah, ended up putting a lot of hours into Diablo 3. Picked up Diablo 4. I'm not quite as taken with it as of yet. I just about got to the end of the game and then just sort of put it down and haven't really had the chance to pick it back up yet. But I do like the sort of the art direction and everything. Like it is still like a Diablo game, but feels very like mobile focused.
Yeah, I thought it was going to be more Diablo 1, Diablo 2-esque, like come back from the super fast-paced, not really an RPG aspect that Diablo 3 became. And the beginning of Diablo 4, I felt like it was, but now that I'm kind of, past the story, working on like the Hell Ties and stuff, it kind of feels like it's going back to Diablo 3, just grind for gear as fast as you can kind of thing. So a little disappointed with that myself as well.
Yeah, I'm pretty hopeful just in the way that Diablo has been working like previously, especially with Diablo 3. Like I said, Diablo 3 Vanilla is such a different beast from what it is now. So they're no strangers to like incrementing and improving as patches come out. So yeah. I feel like they probably will at some point see this feedback and adjust accordingly. But yeah, for now it's kind of a dud.
Yeah, that's fair. That's understandable. You also talked about Slay the Spire. I also put in a few hundred hours into Slay the Spire, but I find that game really difficult to climb those ascension ladders. Like I don't put enough time into like really learning which cards are the good cards and what makes a bad deck. I just kind of jam cards and hope for the best. What's your experience like with Slay the Spire?
I had a reasonable amount of success climbing Ascension, but specifically only with Ironclad, because you kind of have that sort of freedom of just jamming cards into your deck, and it sometimes is just really good. I think I got up to like Ascension 16 or something on specifically Ironclad and nobody else.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, I don't know, just strength stacking and Whirlwind was just like such a game changer for me. And there was some amount of like theory crafting and understanding what cards were good and which weren't. But really, it was like Ironclad or bust for me. None of the other characters really ever grabbed me quite as much as Ironclad did. So as soon as I sort of felt like I was good and like, you know, beat the heart at Ascension 10 plus or whatever, I was just like, yeah, I'm good. But that was like, I think that took me like 750 hours to get to that point.
Yeah. I like the defect. I like jamming cards in the defect. You can get over 30 cards and they just kind of work.
The silence, throw daggers. Gotta throw daggers.
I do like the idea of like Shiv, Silent, and Claw Defect. Claw Defect was like my favorite deck when the defect first dropped, because they had one, I think it was Reprogram as a 0-cost card that used to be look at the top 6 cards, upgrade to 8, and then put any number of them in your graveyard. So that plus like All for One and whatever was just draw all of your claws and just go infinite, and it was crazy.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's I think how I kind of climbed the Ascension ladder with all of them. Like I just forced Shield Bash build, forced Shiv build, and then forced some sort of Claw or somehow like a Lightning Orb build where you just constantly cycle the Lightning Orbs. Yeah. So I got my fair share of losses. Moving on, what kind of got you into Flesh and Blood?
I just sort of heard about it through a bunch of different channels that we have as a result of just being the Spike Feeders. We have a lot of friends in the content creation space, and I think the actual official start of it was we got sort of news from Olivia Gobert-Hicks, who's a very talented, very prominent cosplayer in the Magic community and in the Flesh and Blood community. And she was reached out to by LSS to ask her specifically, hey, would you mind like creating a cosplay for our character Prism and coming to one of our events and like just being here? And what they ended up doing was they not only compensated her, but they also like sent her like thousands of dollars worth of cards as like reference material and like sketches and stuff, like so that she had as much of an idea of as possible of how to turn this 2D character into 3D and actually cosplay her correctly. And personally, just from different experiences with other companies, it was just really refreshing to see a company that was so like person focused, so content creator focused, and really making sure that they have every tool that they need in order to succeed as somebody who just enjoys the game. So as a result of that, as a result of seeing, there were some videos that Luis Scott Vargas, LSV, posted as part of Channel Fireball, where he was sort of demonstrating Flesh and Blood when it first came out. That started my interest in it. It took me a while to finally catch up to that. I started playing just as Tales of Aria dropped. My first ever event was Tales of Aria pre-release. And that was just like the beginning of the end for me, because I saw some cold foils get pulled and I was like, this is the nicest card I've ever seen in my life. So I've started really collecting those and just really appreciating everything that the game has to offer. The whole idea behind Flesh and Blood having these characters that you can really be drawn into and really connect with is just so powerful when it comes to a game and how you interact with it personally. So that's something I really enjoyed as well.
We talk about this a few times on our podcast before, about a lot of our community members are, I don't want to say a one-trick pony, but they really dive into that one hero. And hearing it from you, I think you put it in a really good way. That's probably why people are so dedicated to a hero, whether it be the art style or something about that speaks to them. And they really want to put the time in and invest in that hero. And I think you did a really good job of sort of like putting it in perspective.
Yeah, thank you. There is unfortunately kind of a double-edged sword with that as well. And I really resonate with that, finding a hero that just speaks to you, that you look at them. The first thing that I ask people to do when they're interested in Flesh and Blood is I send them the hero list on the official Flesh and Blood page. And I just say, which of these heroes looks cool? Like, which of these looks interesting to you? I will build you a deck for that hero and you can try them out. And sometimes it'll be, I'm drawn to this art style, or they'll say, in this type of game, I like playing this style. It'll be like, I like playing tokens, I like playing aggro, I like whatever, and sort of go from there. But like I said, the downside to that is if people are really attached to a specific hero that ends up being really good, then Living Legend kind of comes around and kicks you in the teeth a little bit.
Yeah.
There's one local player, specifically Kaylee, who's also a Flesh and Blood judge. She completely fell in love with Starvo when he came out, and like very naturally built the deck and didn't necessarily follow it from like a meta slave standpoint. Didn't want to just play the deck because it was the best. Just the character really resonated with her, and then he ended up being too good and banned, and she has the full deck in like max rarity. Just waiting for us to start playing Living Legend format. But yeah, some people have felt kind of slighted by heroes sort of achieving Living Legend status. So that's something to balance it out. But I think that the overall strength of the connection that people can feel is something that's really important for Flesh and Blood.
Just to think back about something else that you said, do you remember, was it which card it was that really made you say, wow, like, look at this card, this really resonates with me?
I actually do. I know exactly which card it was, and it's unfortunate because it has a bit of a story at my expense around it. I was at the Tales of Aria pre-release, and my friend Jerry, who's also on the Spike Feeders, he opened up a cold foil Duskblade, and that was like the first cold foil that I had seen thus far. And I was like, oh my god, like it's so cool. The foiling looks so nice. It's like textured. It has like it's a majestic, so it's really neat. And I was looking at the effect, and I'm like, yeah, this card's insane. So I was like, do you want this card? And he's like, no, I'm not interested in Runeblade. He wanted to play Oldhim. And so I was like, okay, I'll buy this card off of you. And we looked up the prices, and it was just around $300 Canadian. Yeah. So what I ended up doing was trading him for it, buying him a bunch of staples so that he could just get into the game, trading for it. And then like a week and a half later, it was banned.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I still like don't regret that because, it's sort of plays into, I think, a lot of the reason why you wanted to reach out to me, but it was more important to me to get somebody the foothold that they needed to start playing the game than it was for me to get a good deal on that. And of course, now the card has a story behind it too, which to me is just worth it anyway.
Yeah, those were truly the Wild West days of, and I've said this a couple times, I'm not very savvy when it comes to the financial side of what cards are up and what's down, but I'm glad that we're not at the stage where CFMs are hundreds of dollars, like on set release back in Monarch and Tales. It was pretty wild. Yeah,
it was crazy. The Monarch CF's pre-releases, like Husk being $900 Canadian, was absolutely ridiculous. And I agree with you. I'm glad we're not there anymore. Because it's too much, and that's part of like I think that public gets a glimpse of that, and they're like, well, this game is way too expensive, and that's not what we want, especially as community people that want to bring people in the game. That's the last thing we want to see, is that a barrier of entry for a hero that might be interesting starts at $1,000 for a single card. That's not healthy in any way.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, and it is something that I think is in the process of being addressed with just current ideologies behind how they're creating these, like, they have the new Marvel rarity, which does as a result kind of offset the prices of other things. They got rid of the unlimited printing being separate, so now there's like you can get any of the legendaries from the most recent set from Outsiders, and I think the most expensive one is like $50, which still, like, I don't want to downplay that to people that can still be expensive, and that's like something that I definitely don't want to brush aside. But like you look at from a previous set from Tales of Aria, even from when I started, and New Horizons is still like a $250 card, and like that's too much. Like I'm a pretty entrenched player at this point. I'm pretty enfranchised. I have like every card that I could possibly need, but I would be ecstatic if these cards just plummeted in price, because I just want people to play. I don't care about the financial side of it. It is more interesting for me to have a play group than it is for me to just have these cards and having no one to play with because they either can't afford it or they just don't want to, because it's a totally normal and human thing to not want to spend every dollar of your paycheck just to play a hobby.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. So how did the Spike Feeders FAB offshoot get started from the main channel of the Spike Feeders?
It was a pretty reasonable evolution of what we were doing anyway. Like I said, I sort of started to get disenfranchised with Magic, and I've gone on record about that a couple times, and I don't really want to just keep driving the point home. But anyway, long story short, I just started to not be interested in Magic as much as I was, and like I was very all in on Magic. That was like my main hobby. I still have a decent number of really, really nice cards, but just playing it just really wasn't resonating with me. And then sort of picked up Flesh and Blood, really enjoyed it, got a couple of the other people from the Spike Feeders and some friends to get into it as well. And my brother, Jim from the Spike Feeders, is very much content focused. It is something that he just really appreciates and enjoys, is creating content and creating opportunities for content as well. So at some point we had just been playing, we had been sort of totally head down, blinders on, just like Flesh and Blood is the thing that I'm interested in. And he just approached me and said, look, like, this is much easier. Like the idea of a 1v1 format, just top down, whatever. We're already doing like 4-player games. This is a lot more editing and we're already okay with it. Do you find any value in creating like 1v1 format, like edited gameplay, high quality? Because there were other people in the game that were already doing it. Most notably Fabrica, I think, was the sort of the big one at the time. And they are still, of course, a big one. I think they're still much more successful than we are at it. But it's like, like, why not? We're already, because of the filming that we were doing with Commander, with EDH, we were just in a position where we could kind of just start it up and get it ready. And it ended up being not a huge drain on our current resources. So we figured, why not try? And I think we've gotten into a spot where it's slightly more feasible to keep going, even though as the time has sort of dragged on, it's like myself and Elliot are kind of the only people, at least as part of the Spike Feeders, who are still like really into Flesh and Blood. Like Jan was also in there. I mentioned Jerry, the one that pulled the Duskblade. He hasn't played like since that pre-release, basically. So yeah, without a wider pool of people to choose from, it can be difficult to just get schedules to line up. But other than that, it's basically just an extension of what we were already doing, and ended up being just kind of an easy thing to try out and do. So we're very lucky to have been in that position, of course, to have that infrastructure in place. So,
I do want to shout out your channel, Spike Feeders FAB, for being so approachable and casual and fun. Like, and it doesn't seem to matter what decks are being showcased, from the Starvo Gauntlet in CC to all of the very unfortunately timed one, no fault of your own, but to all the Blitz Gauntlets that you do. I mean, gameplay aside, and we know that you're not there for like Michael Hamilton type plays. You're there to have fun, to showcase some cool plays, what are the cool splashy things we can do. And that reminds me a lot about how I have the most fun playing Flesh and Blood as well. So no, huge shout out for that.
Yeah, thank you. That's something that is really important to us as well, because if we were just all about like top tier competitive content, we are competing against, like you said, we're competing against the Michael Hamiltons, and there isn't a competition there. Like I don't have any illusions about where our content lies when it comes to like being super spiky, which I think is fine. And that's a lot of where our initial Commander content came from as well, is just showing people that, you know, in this game that can be really competitive, it's also important and possible to just have fun with it too. So yeah, that's basically our mission statement.
Yeah, I mean, can you expand on that a little bit? Because going back to what you said, and Spike Feeders is focused on a format called competitive EDH, right? Which is a very optimal, very competitive way, theoretically, of taking a casual format. But was it always the mission of the Spike Feeders to take it to a more casual and approachable level?
Yes. Yeah, it actually was from day one our intent to showcase high-powered gameplay, but not in any sort of, like you said, like not in an unapproachable way. Because something that we did notice with some other content creators that were doing CEDH content at the time, it was very robotic. It was very stiff and just not a ton of fun to watch. Like it was very much about the competitive part of it and less about the actual interactions that you were having with people. And EDH at its core is a very approachable format.
Yes.
At least that's the intent. That's why it's become such a big force of Magic. But yeah, it all started. I pulled a Teysa Envoy of Ghosts from Guilds of Ravnica draft that I was at, or not guilds, even older than that, Return to Ravnica, I think it was. And I was like, I just want to play this card in a deck. It's not good, but I'm going to build a commander deck. And then I hounded all of the other guys to build commander decks so that we could play. And then we finally did. And then we got to that point in Commander where you're just having like 4-hour games and everybody checks out and it's just like not fun anymore.
Right.
I was like, I'm just going to start playing good cards. And then sort of started that arms race, got things good to go a little bit faster and faster. And yeah, we were playing like these sort of, like I said, faster and faster and faster and more optimal decks. But we were still like throwing shots at each other and just having a good time and laughing. And then we were seeing this other content that was around and realizing that like there was this sort of stigma around playing higher power stuff. And it's like, well, this isn't like how it always has to be. Like you can have fun playing Yawgmoth's Will. That's allowed. And yeah, anyway, so it sort of went from that to why don't we make content to show people that it's okay to laugh while playing these powerful cards. And yeah, it just looks like we kind of hit a niche that needed to be hit, and people really resonated with that. So I'm glad that we're able to keep that going even into a different game entirely, and sort of keep that approachable, social, fun environment intact.
Yeah, exactly. Even in a 1v1 focused game like FAB, I mean, obviously a lot different. You lack a lot of the politics and the social interactions, but still, just because you're playing optimally or trying to, even Shea and I, we talk all the time about, we try to be casually competitive within the extent of what we're able to as adults with, you know, responsibilities, but there's nothing stopping us from trying to be competitive, trying to be Spikes sometimes, but still having a very good time, being very friendly about it, very sportsmanlike. And I mean, I definitely see that within both your FAB channel and your main channel as well. Yeah. All right. Well, let's move on to our next topic here, community building. And that's something that is very important to all of us here. And Bill, you do talk about your local scene from time to time on the Living Legends podcast. And I'd love to hear more about the scene in Winnipeg and I guess specifically what you do to help grow that community.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I ended up getting into it, there was already still a scene. It was slightly smaller than it is now. And we've had some people sort of drift out and then new players join as well. But one of the main things that sort of helped me sort of try to facilitate a community was you won't be able to see this as a listener of the podcast, but Felix and Shea can both see just behind me, these boxes here, that's all Flesh and Blood bulk.
I was gonna ask.
Oh boy.
I was gonna ask if that was Magic or Flesh and Blood.
There's 1, 2,
no, that
3,
is all
4, 5, 6 pizza boxes, I believe.
Yeah, those are all 5 rows, and they're basically filled to the brim. But yeah, I just love opening packs, and it was more reasonable for me to open boxes and even up to cases sometimes of Flesh and Blood than it was when I played Magic, because the boxes were just that much more expensive or whatever, or maybe I just didn't I wasn't as fiscally irresponsible back then. But as a result, I was able to sort of work that into making things a little bit easier, because obviously with our offerings for LGSs being pretty sparse, like we do have 3 very high quality LGSs, but only 2 of them kind of do singles, and they don't have a very big variety of singles. So if you were looking for specific cards for a deck, most of the time you have to look outward. You have to look, to other stores within Canada, sometimes even to the States, like through TCG Player. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you both know, being Canadians in a card game space, ordering singles off of TCG Player to Canada is a nightmare. It is so expensive.
It's bad.
And yeah, there's like 0 options. It's really unfortunate. So as a result of me deciding to just open up a bunch of boxes and stuff, I have tons of traders. Maybe not as much as I did maybe like a year ago, but it became kind of a meme within our community of like, if you're looking for a card, just ask Bill and he'll hook you up. So that really, it felt good to do that as well, because sort of like I was saying, where whenever somebody new is looking to get into the game, I just ask them like, what hero do you like? And because I have all of this bulk, I just build them like a commoner blitz deck and just give it to them for free, because there's nothing else that this bulk is doing anyway, so I might as well use it to see if somebody likes the game. And it's been pretty helpful so far. A lot of the people in our local community have sort of appreciated that. I think I don't want to speak too highly of what I've done, because I don't want to bloviate like that, but from what I've seen and sort of the reaction that I've gotten, it just helps, because otherwise, again, you have to buy something off of TCG Player. If it's a full deck of these like commons that I have thousands of at this point, and you're even paying like 15 cents a card, like that really adds up. And that can be like you said earlier with the example of Carrion Husk. Even if it's not $900, sometimes it's, the TCG Player order ends up being $75, and sometimes that's too much if you're just trying to get a feel for how a game is. So that was something I was able to utilize to make it a little bit easier to break through that barrier of entry and make it more reasonable for somebody to be like, okay, I will spend $75 on this game. I will buy that Courage of Bladehold that I was looking at because I like Dorinthia, and I found out because I got this deck. So yeah, that's some of the things that I've been able to do personally to try to make things a little bit better. And of course, just, at local events, just being polite to people and being understanding, because, every event that isn't a Road to Nats, you're just there to have a good time and play the game. Like, don't rule shark people at a regular armory event.
Absolutely not. No, that's so nice to hear. And I would just like to ask as well, because you mentioned that the Tales pre-release was one of the first bigger events for Winnipeg. And that was around 1.5 to 2 years ago. Geez, like time is always difficult to think of. So I like to think that, there could be a lot of excitement for a new game, some kind of honeymoon period. That's inevitable for anything that's new, and a lot of people checking something out for the first time. But then, of course, after a couple months or maybe after a year, people move on. So for Winnipeg specifically, have you seen a little bit of that rush or a bit of that ebb and flow, or has it been fairly steady for the last 1.5 to 2 years, or how's that?
There is definitely a core group of people locally that have been here like since the start. I was definitely not part of the first wave. There were some amount of people that were around, like Crew Monarch. We didn't really have much locally when that was happening. We have one local person who currently works at one of the LGSs that has been into Flesh and Blood since the absolute beginning, like was buying cases of Alpha Welcome to Wraith from the US for like $500 because it was just, it was new. It was the thing. But yeah, there is like a core of, I'd say probably like 8 to 10 people, I think that's doing the math correctly. And of course, there were sort of more people at the start that don't play quite as much, and there are also new people that have started to show up more frequently and become part of the community. And there is definitely like a little bit of an ebb, especially when bigger events happen. There are a couple of times where I've noticed sort of new people show up and then just kind of either sort of dwindle out as the months go on, or they just go to the one big event and we don't really see them again after that. But yeah, it's nice to have sort of a core of people, and then sometimes you get another bite, sometimes you get another person that shows up, and you sort of try to cultivate that as best you can, because we're already so small of a community that there's really no room to like try to push people away. Yeah. Obviously that's not what anybody wants to do, but it can be sort of a balance when you want to add more people.
When you have those lulls, you typically, I think, between sets, when you start to get to the end of a set, do you have or do you guys do anything in your community to try and like revitalize that? You start to see attendance to drop. Do you guys think of a plan or a new way to engage the existing community to kind of come out to events before we get to that fresh new set, or maybe a competitive season or something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. We do in some capacity. Like I said, our core is pretty loyal and pretty consistent. But there are definitely times where, I think even relatively recently, I think it was in the last 6 months, there was one where a weekend event just like straight up couldn't fire because I think only 2 or 3 people showed up, and that felt kind of bad. So something that I've noticed local stores do, if they sort of anticipate that to happen, is they'll actually like poll the community and be like, what type of event do you want to see next week? Instead of just having a set in stone schedule, it'll be like, okay, we could do a draft next week if you want, or we could do CC, we could do Blitz, we could do Commoner even. Like the option has basically always, honestly, been left up to the will of the masses, which I think definitely helps, because there's a large contingent of our regular locals that much prefer CC over Blitz, even though Blitz is the more sort of approachable format of the two. We have a lot of people that just prefer it as a format. So a lot of our events end up being CC because we know that the sort of loyal core will be there, and thus the event will fire.
Yeah, that's great to hear that the stores and the community is willing to be responsive like that, and if there is a need or there's an issue. That core of players, or even some of the new players, I'm always curious to hear other scenes and other communities' experience. In Calgary, for example, it's not like 90% of us are former Magic players. We have a huge variety of different backgrounds. Like Shea and I come from board games, and of course there are Magic players, there's Pokemon players, Yu-Gi-Oh! So we have quite an eclectic mix of backgrounds. Is it the same for you guys, or is it more a lot of Magic players? What kind of backgrounds do people have that are interested in this game?
It's actually kind of funny because we do a decent amount of almost like comparing. I don't know if everybody in our local scene does that necessarily, but for sort of specific backgrounds, a lot of them are just former TCG players. Not as many of them as you might think come specifically from Magic. We have a decent amount of people that come from like there was like a Star Wars TCG recently within the last decade or something.
Destiny,
I think it was Star Wars Destiny, and then Legend of the Five Rings. There's a decent amount of our current group that used to play that. It's a lot of people who sort of come from I think Netrunner as well. was another relatively big one. But it is like mostly card games and mostly people that had like a competitive edge to the card games that they interacted with. And then it's like, I almost want to say sort of unrelated, but not really. A lot of them are also just really like intelligent people. Like we have a bunch of like high level computer programmers, and there's like a couple of doctors and like professors and stuff. And then there's just me. But
no, Bill,
yeah.
I agree. Flesh and Blood players are the most intelligent people out there. 100%.
Their brains are so big.
Huge.
Yeah.
It's funny that you mentioned basically a bunch of FFG players looking for a new home. It's not the first time we've heard that story either. So
yeah.
You know.
No, it is really funny. There are some people that still sort of look back longingly on their times with Legend of the Five Rings, but they also, like, as much as I say that, they haven't really looked back. Like a lot of the people that came from that found a really solid home in Flesh and Blood, and I think that that's really cool as well. That it's just like it's a space where if you felt competitive in a previous game and you vibe with the game itself, you can likely find a decent spot here as well.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Is your scene, would you characterize it as fairly casual, or is it getting to be more competitive with your skirmishes and your tier 2 events like RTNs and ProQuests?
We definitely have I would say a majority of our regular locals are like on the higher end of the competitive scale. We have a handful of players that have qualified for nationals. One of our locals, Seth Penner, has been to, I believe, 3 at this point. And we have level 1, soon to be level 2 judge, Grant Bartel, who's also a very, very talented Kano player, who I think is planning on going to or has gone to one of the nationals. If you're listening to this, Grant, I'm sorry. But
Grant is a legend in the judge community, and he was also at the top tables last Canadian Nationals. So yeah, big shout out to Grant.
Yeah, Grant Bartel, he's a friend of the channel and a friend of mine. I actually have some cards to pick up from him at some point. He was clamoring to judge the Road to Nats that we had because he needs more high level events so that he can be a level 2 judge. So I ended up buying one of his Therions from him. But yeah, so we have a decent amount of like people who are striving for Nats, people who either want to earn them from the Road to Nats and get their invites, or just through XP alone. And we have, there's at least one additional person, his name is Abe, who's also a very talented player, who I believe qualified through XP alone.
Oh, nice.
So yeah, it does tend towards more competitive, but also because we sort of know each other quite well, we can keep it relatively lighthearted, and people don't get like, overly salty or really down in the dumps if they're not performing well. Everybody's sort of there under the understanding that they're there for a good time, but also like optimal play is encouraged and expected. So yeah, it's a very sort of, I don't know, it feels different from a lot of the other card game events that I've personally been to. Most of the time you have one but not the other.
No, that's great. And sounds a lot like our scene. I mean, Shea, we talk about this all the time, casual, competitive, both, right?
Yeah, I was going to say exactly the same thing. The scene sounds very similar in that, yeah, we have people that want to do well and push to become better players, but it's not the be all end all. Having fun is also top priority as well. So it sounds very similar. Speaking a little bit to traveling, a little bit, does Winnipeg feel connected to like the broader Canadian scene, or do you kind of, I guess, feel sort of like we do out here in Calgary, a bit more isolated, like you're on your own island?
I definitely resonate with the idea of us feeling more like an island. Most of the time, it's actually quite funny when I hear about events that are happening in like Toronto or something like that. It's mostly always Toronto because of course it is. But I'll, talk to some of my American friends and they'll be like, oh, are you going to this event in Toronto? You could probably just drive there, right? I'm like, it is an 8-hour drive. And then also flights there are $300 because of course they are. Actually, they're probably even more expensive than that. But so it can feel tough at times because every event that happens it just feels like a million years away wherever it is. So while we have a really good scene locally and at the 3 stores that we normally do, we don't really have much interaction with places past that, other than we have had some people. Apparently there's a very small contingent of people that play in Brandon, which is another sort of town within Manitoba. We also had somebody fly in from BC one time who was just doing hops to different road to nats across Canada. But yeah, as far as I know, none of us locally actually specifically drive out to other LGSs outside of Manitoba. So yeah, it can feel not necessarily stale, but yeah, isolating, like you had mentioned.
Yeah. How important is it for you to have access to tier 2 and tier 3 in events? And further to that, what do you think will trigger LSS to look at, I guess, the prairies as a grader, as an option to host those events?
It would be, I don't know, it would be kind of tough because we don't have the player base just at a critical mass to really pull that many people. I mean, if there was a big event, I'm sure people would show up. And as much as people love to rag on Winnipeg, myself included, it actually does have a pretty decent scene for food and entertainment and stuff to do. It's maybe not as impressive as something like Vegas, obviously, but I don't think it would be that bad of an option. Getting anybody to do anything in the prairies is just tough.
So I don't know anything about greater events, but I wonder, is that actually a consideration for a company like LSS or Star City Games when they're looking at planning the major events? Do you think they actually look into, I guess, the city life of the city, or do they just look at population density and go, yeah, we're going to plunk an event down here? Or is the greater options, a consideration?
I think it's a mix of a couple different things. One of the main things is making sure they have enough of an infrastructure to do so. So we have an event center that is quite substantial, but I don't know, depending on what they would require, if our event center would be good enough. Mm-hmm. That's one of the reasons why sometimes when events happen, it'll be in a big place like Vegas, or it'll feel like it's just in a random place, but it's because they just have a huge convention center for whatever reason. Yeah. But yeah, I think population and I think that does also play into it. I do have obviously some amount of not what's the word I'm looking for? Extended information contact, through people that I know who have connections to the event programmers at LSS. Mm-hmm. That there's a lot that goes into it, and there's maybe a few reasons why Worlds hasn't been announced yet.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a lot more complicated than it seems, and I wish it wasn't as complicated, but also it feels like there's just a reason why they don't pick the prairies, and I don't know what that reason is.
Yep, that's fair. Is there anything that you wish that LSS could do better to serve local communities, or do you feel that the level of support that we're getting is, pretty good comparable to other games?
Honestly, I think they do a really good job. Their support of local communities and like I was saying earlier with cosplayers and people who really want to engage with the game, they do a really good job at finding ways that are not necessarily completely monetary to ensure that people are compensated. And as sort of antithetical as that sounds, I think one of the main things that illustrates the point is just the Taylor promo that cosplayers get as topping a cosplay contest. That is a card that costs them $0 to create. they just print it out and they're able to hand it out as a promo, and then it sells for like $3,500.
Yep.
Like, it is something that cosplayers can then turn around and sell to, basically make their own prize money. And I think that that's really cool, because that's something sustainable that LSS can do without signing themselves up for a multi-million-dollar event. And there was a whole controversy in Magic where they handed out Joanne's Fabric gift cards instead of just like money as a prize card, or as a prize for a cosplay event. And that sort of rang hollow for some people, especially because they had already spent all of their money to make the costume to then enter the contest. So, but yeah, Magic aside, I think that LSS actually does a really good job. The support kits that they send out for armories and stuff are actually quite good, and end up being a driving force behind people wanting to, especially the cold foils that you can get at sort of the top end of things.
How important is it to make connections online, I guess, for your scene, be it for yourself or for the other members of your community? Because, and I'm guessing that it's somewhat important, because when I think about Winnipeg, it's a smaller city within Canada, but there are a few notable people within FAB from Winnipeg that I know about. There's, of course, yourself with the Living Legends podcast, but there's Kaylee with everything she does for even the new Pitch Perfect Rainbow League that's come out. And of course, there's Grant, who is a mainstay on the Judge Discord. So, I mean, for us in Calgary, Shea mentioned we have our rivalry with Edmonton that additionally kind of motivates us. But for you guys, like, does that online aspect really add something to your scene and increase your level of engagement with the game?
Yeah, personally, I would say that it does. Obviously, we already have a decent amount of contact with people online, just through the Spike Feeders as a whole. We have our whole Discord where we have like a pretty thriving community. So the fact that a subset of that community is also Flesh and Blood, it just makes it so much more of a complete experience, because you have your own local community, and whether that be fulfilling, like I would say ours is, or sometimes maybe it's an unfulfilling experience for people. I've heard stories of people going out to their local event and just getting stomped unapologetically, and it's like, well, that's not really something that I want to do with my free time. I would prefer to have fun. But you can sort of, regardless of your experience, you can then reach out to like-minded people, and you can start to compare notes about like, oh, how was your event? Like, how did you do? What is your meta like? Is there anything that you're seeing that is sort of different from what my meta is like? Maybe something else that I can try to have more fun, or how were you countering this in your local community? And just being able to compare notes and stories, I think, is just a really valuable part of feeling like a more engaged and complete member of really any community, but I think specifically Flesh and Blood as well, because just tech options, I think, as a result of just people like throwing their head against a wall, and in respect to certain matchups. Obviously I'm referring to Oldhim, but just finding
you deserve it.
But no, just like finding ways to sort of overcome a common enemy together, I think can be really satisfying and really fulfilling. And just having more opportunity to do that with people who have a different perspective, I think, is really cool.
Oh, thank you.
Nice. Moving on, just like us, you're also a judge. Was there something that catapulted you into deciding to go down this path?
I have always just sort of wanted to be in that capacity, in like a judge sort of capacity, understanding the rules, etc. Basically, ever since I started playing card games, like back in the day, I was a Yu-Gi-Oh judge technically. I wanted to become a Magic judge, but just never went down that path. And then realized that the judge program for Flesh and Blood was like relatively new. It wasn't really a fully realized thing. This was still at the point where you kind of just had to like fill out a PDF on Flesh and Blood's website, and they'll be like, "We'll contact you."
Yeah.
I just felt like to better help the facilitation of the game, I wasn't aware if other people would become a judge, and that would directly impact our ability to hold higher level events. Because, if you're holding a Road to Nats, you need a judge, and that's just how it is. Yep. So I figured, I don't care enough about the competitive aspect to really like clamor to compete in these. But if it means that people can play in these events and that we can have them, then that's the more important part. So yeah, really it was just from a stance of, I want to make sure that we have the capacity to hold these types of events. And then obviously Grant came along and he's a way better judge than I am. So.
Is there like a little rivalry between you? How do you guys, in a smaller scene, I guess, separate, or do you guys delineate who gets to do what events?
Most of the time it was just Grant wanted to play in the event more than he wanted to judge it. Okay. He also sort of lives out of town. So there was one event where he was going to judge, but ended up getting snowed in. So Winnipeg. I kind of got, yeah, I got contacted basically at the 11th hour, and our game store owner was like, "Hey, are you free by any chance for the next 6 hours?" Most of the time it just sort of defaulted to me. Okay. I was always happy to just go and hang out and obviously get the judge support. I liked that too.
Yeah. So, it's nice. How was your experience doing the, getting called at the 11th hour, and how was that experience for you?
It was actually, thankfully, it was able to pan out. I'm glad that I was able to sort of respond at that time, because otherwise, again, it was a Road to Nats, and if I wasn't able to do it, then the event just wouldn't have been able to fire, and that would have been a huge bummer, as they say. So there were actually a couple of times, I think, that I've had to do, I think it was exactly 2 times. It was for the same owner and in the same sort of situation. There was one time I was driving home from my parents' place, which is outside of the city. And then the other time was, Grant got snowed in and just all of a sudden needed a replacement. But it was nice. It was also obviously like the community was really appreciative of it, which selfishly did feel good. But really at the end of the day, it was just to make sure that people are able to interact with the game in the way that they choose to, which again, because of our local scene being quite competitive, this is something that people were looking forward to. This was an event that was important. Being able to make that happen, I think was, it was nice. Again, selfishly, but
yeah. So I guess addressing kind of the way you look at the competitive, or how you are competitively in the game, do you like judging, or is it sort of like a role that you just do to fill so that other people can enjoy the game the way they want to?
It's a little bit of both. I have found personally the most success playing competitively in Flesh and Blood than I have for most other games. I do like to play games, but most of the time I just don't end up finding that success. Yeah. I don't know if it's just the way that I interact with them personally, but when it comes to higher level events, I know probably that I either won't get to the point where I'll get the invite, or if I do get the invite, it won't be as interesting to me because I generally don't have a ton of time or money to travel. Yep. So it is, more, I do like to play the game competitively. And like when we were doing our skirmishes, I was actually able to do a lot better than I thought I was able to. I ever thought I was ever going to be able to. I ended up going top 8, then top 4, then top 2 in the 3 events that we had.
That's awesome.
So yeah, that felt kind of good. But yeah, ultimately it's just I'm available for whatever capacity the local community needs me to be. So if they need a judge, you got it, man. Yeah. If you need somebody else to fire this event, you got it, man. I just really appreciate the game, and I kind of like how it's not necessarily underdeveloped, our local community is, but it is just like, it's small, so it needs the support, or at least the support helps a lot more than it would for a bigger scene like Magic would. So yeah, it's just something that I take a lot of enjoyment in, is making sure that people can play this game, because I think it's really cool. I think it's a nice game.
It's pretty fun, I hear. Touching a little bit on your success in skirmishes, I kind of saw your face light up, like myself as well. Like, this is my first competitive game, and when I started to find a little bit of success in skirmishes and RTNs, as a casual competitive person, like we kind of talked about, man, did it feel good to actually, you've been playing the game and putting in not a ton of time like some other people that would be hyper competitive, but when you find those marks where you hit like a top 8 or a top 4, holy cow, does it feel good. And I saw that reaction in your face when you were talking about it. I'm like, you kind of gave me goosebumps. I'm like, I remember that. It felt really good, and it was like one of the most rewarding moments and probably most recent part of my life. And it was really exciting to see you kind of react that way talking about it.
Yeah, it's so, sorry Bill, but it's so specific to local tournaments as well, because if you're just playing a video game online, then hey, I won a match, on to the next one. I moved up 2,000 points in the ladder, now I'm ranked 300,000 in the world. Like, let's keep going up. But to actually have success like that, and just like Shea mentioned, yeah, that's awesome to hear.
Yeah, it's also one of those things, specifically with Flesh and Blood, where your success with the game, I feel like, is dictated a lot more by your knowledge of the game than it is just paying to win. Like we were sort of mentioning before, there are specific game pieces that do increase your chance to win by percentage points, but I think that somebody with a cheap deck and a ton of knowledge with a specific matchup will win a lot of the time over somebody who has less knowledge and a more expensive deck. So especially when you're in those positions where, you've, like Shea said, put in the time with your specific deck or strategy or whatever, and you finally start to feel that success, it's like really, really gratifying. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things that kind of makes you chase the game and look for more.
Yeah. That's addictive. Well, move on to our next topic here, and this is something that Shea and I are always very curious about, because like Shea mentioned, both of us are somewhat outsiders to the TCG sphere before Flesh and Blood, and it's you have a lot more experience than us, both through the Spike Feeders and also just through your background. And we are very curious because a lot of people say the FAB community, and you alluded to this, that the FAB community is special, it's good in some way, it's positive, the people are passionate. And I would just like to hear your thoughts on that. Is that true both locally for you and also through your interactions with the broader FAB community online through perhaps your work with the Living Legends podcast?
As a general rule, yes. A lot of the experience that I have had personally and have heard through other people is that Flesh and Blood, just specifically, I don't know what it is about Flesh and Blood communities, but they are overwhelmingly positive. That, of course, doesn't discount any of interactions that people have had that have not been positive. But even just drawing from my own personal experiences, going to local events for Flesh and Blood, I have never felt like I was not welcome, or that I was an outsider, or that I was like, I don't even know how to describe it other than like being derided or being made fun of. There are a handful of stories that just come to mind immediately of me going to different events like Yu-Gi-Oh! And Magic locally, and just felt like such an outsider and so unwelcomed. The local community just being very insular with their group of people that know each other super, super well and are almost like xenophobic when it comes to new people trying to break into that space. Yeah, that's just something that personally feels so unbelievably bad, and I'm sure I'm the only person who feels this way, but yeah, it's something that I'm very conscious of when it comes to at least my interactions with local people. I want to make sure that if somebody is new and they're just here testing something out, or there was a couple times where people just showed up with a freshly sleeved precon with no changes, I just want to, I maybe even overcorrect for it sometimes, but I just want to make sure that people feel like, you know, even though you're playing against people who have like top tier high level decks, that like you still belong here. This is something that you are allowed to do. And like, even if you don't find like competitive success, you should still find friendship success. Like, we want you to be here, sort of thing. And yeah, that specifically, for some reason, that just feels so tailored specifically to the Flesh and Blood experience, at least for me.
Yeah, I've noticed it too. You touched on it, that like sometimes we're maybe a little over the top. I find in our community, I kind of call it like we're aggressively friendly. Like we want you so badly to come into the community, because I always talk about like this game can't exist without people. So it needs to grow. We always want more people. So sometimes I wonder if we're like, I hope we're not off-putting by being too friendly and by like giving people chaff and just like really engaging with them. But I, you know, it's something that we also do here too, I noticed. So it's funny to hear you say kind of the same thing.
Yeah, it's just something that especially I thought of when there was a situation, like I said, where somebody just got a Lexi precon and they sleeved it up and brought it, and ended up playing against them. And unfortunately, as the story goes, I completely ranched them. But afterwards, you know, I was talking about them. I was like, I love Lexi. I think this deck is really cool. And I ended up giving them, I just had an extra like Pulse of Volthaven in my binder. And I was just like, yeah, here you go. Like, this isn't in the precon, but this is a really good card for the deck. So I think you like, here you go. And every so often I think back on that and I was like, I hope that didn't come across as me like making fun of them or giving them charity or something. It's just like, I know this deck and I know you would like this card and it doesn't matter to me. So here you go.
I'm going to pull on a thread a little bit here, Bill. I know you said you don't know why, but I mean, have you noticed, do you think FAB tracks maybe a slightly older audience than other games potentially, or can you speculate even as to what the reason is, or could it just be, again, the honeymoon effect, that it's still something new, and as it grows, we're just destined to become like any other community with all the good and the bad?
I do think that, again, I've heard mostly stories that are overwhelmingly positive, but I have none that come to mind, unfortunately, but I have heard stories of people having less than desirable experiences within their local meta. And I feel like they do exist, but they are less common. And I think that you're sort of on the nose there with just sort of a generally more like just an older audience of people who have some amount of experience with, if not card games, just gaming in general. And with the community being smaller anyway, it maybe even self-selects people who are not pleasant, because instead of hiding in like a 64-person tournament where, you know, oh, I'm against this person and either I've never seen them before or I know that they're a jerk or whatever, but they're sort of within the ranks and you don't always play against them. In these local events that are smaller, you basically play against every person there at least once. So if somebody is overwhelmingly negative or overwhelmingly unpleasant, then like, I don't want to say that they get forced out, but I feel like they would probably just not get the interaction that they're looking for and sort of leave on their own terms. So I don't know. Yeah. Like I said, a lot of the people that are in our local scene are really like successful and professional people. There are a few people that are part of our scene that are sort of on the younger side, but really I think the youngest person is maybe 18. It's not quite like local Yu-Gi-Oh and Pokemon events where it's like you're trying to beat up an 8-year-old at your favorite card game. So yeah, I don't know, maybe there's just an inherent level of, I don't want to say maturity because that feels so like snooty to say, but you know, in sort of just a broader, more general way, at least the people that I've experienced have just like, they have an understanding about how they want to interact with the game.
Kind of add to your point, I think too, that while we do have I think a more older touch on the game, that the younger people, there's less of them too. So they have to, I don't know if they have to, it's not really the right word to say it, but fit into to a more mature or older crowd too. They don't get to just hang out with their group of younger friends and have that same level of action or emotion the way they typically do. And I think they probably end up taking a lead from some of the older people as well, that like, I probably need to behave differently in this group because I am, not with all of my friends maybe.
Yeah. And there might even be, like, I don't know if this is me just totally speculating here, but there might even be a gameplay reason for that as well. I feel like Flesh and Blood doesn't lend itself to like overly flashy plays, like Yu-Gi-Oh, like Magic would, where it's like, I slam down my 7-drop and you can't beat this. Whereas with Flesh and Blood, it's like incremental advantage over a time, or like you have one play, but it's something that just gives you an amount of leverage over the tempo of the game where you can then sort of use that to your advantage. So instead of being like, I summon my Blue Eyes White Dragon, it's like, I block this thing only with one card from my hand. So now I can like crippling crush you with Dominate. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe there's something to that as well. That's just me sort of spitballing off the top of the dome. But yeah, it's almost like a slower burn when it comes to card games and the excitement, like you said, that you get out of it.
I think that's a really good way to put it, though, is that, yeah, it's incremental, it's slow, it doesn't have that big boom, here it is, eat it moment.
Yeah, and games are just sort of more back and forth. Like, that's one of the things I love about Flesh and Blood as well, is that you never, unless you're having it's a specific matchup or you're in like a really bad game or you get a bad draw or whatever, a lot of Flesh and Blood games feel very down to the wire, like very back and forth. The amount of games that I've had that I've gone to like 1-1 far outweigh the ones that I've had that are just a complete landslide.
Yeah.
Oh, that's such a fascinating point, Bill. I've never had it explained to me like that. Just the type of plays that you make, and maybe more incremental, less flashy, but it makes a lot of sense when you say that. I guess the last question that I have on this particular topic is, if you did have some advice to keep the community positive and in this, all the traits that you described, I guess what would that be, drawing on from all of your experience with different card games?
It's a really good question, because I don't know exactly how much more growth we're going to see. I would love to see more growth within our local community, but it feels like there's still sort of a catalyst event that needs to happen for us to go from, basically getting a pretty consistent like 10 to 12 people, maybe up to 16 on a special day, going from that to getting like constantly 25 people plus, 30 people plus, which you would see, at most other events for larger card games, whether they be Yu-Gi-Oh or Magic. But I think the most important thing to try to keep the current feel and environment that we currently have is just to have the split of events that people want, which is unfortunate because sometimes it can feel like you're splintering the community into separate things. But if the competitive people always have to play in casual events or like blitz events if they only want to play CC, or vice versa, if there are people who only want to play blitz but you only ever have CC, then you're just going to self-select those people out anyway. So I think it's important for game stores to recognize that and to realize that people won't always want to play the same type of event. And whether or not that means you split them so that, there are 2 events running concurrently, or you switch back and forth as weeks happen, catering to a pretty wide swath of people, I think is a really key thing to keep an eye out for, because it can be very easy to look past that and just say, well, most of the people here want to play CC. That's great. But then you're locking yourself into that demographic, or you're pushing away the people that want to do competitive stuff. So it's a balance that needs to happen in some capacity, and it's better for you to make that choice instead of having it made for you.
Thank you.
Guess we'll jump into the next topic. You are 1/3 of the Living Legend podcast, one of the most successful podcasts in Flesh and Blood. What was the spark behind that starting?
I think it was Kel just sort of reaching out to me, Red Zone Rogue. It was he reached out to me on Twitter and basically just said, "Hey, do you want to make a podcast?" And it was basically just the idea was we had a lot of most of the podcast space, especially at that time, was mostly taken up by Arsenal Pass, and it was very competitive focused. It was more about what the current meta is and breaking that stuff down. And it was myself, Kel, and Az, who just sort of realized like there's a lot that goes into this game, and there's a lot of stuff that people latch onto as well. Like I was saying earlier, people they like to play this game because it sort of lends itself to being competitive, but it also lends itself to latching onto characters and like we were kind of mentioning, cosplay and the lore behind the characters and just the art style in general. I love the art that's done. I have multiple artist proofs from Carlos Cruchaga.
Nice.
Who's one of my favorite artists in the game. And just being able to interact with the game on that axis as well, instead of just treating it as a card game, it is like it's a greater community. So that was something that really sort of spoke to us, something that we really wanted to just make, we wanted to put more of a spotlight on the fact that there's so much that goes into Flesh and Blood outside of just the competitive aspect. So we wanted to, I think our original tagline was going to be your one-stop shop for everything related to the world of Flesh and Blood or something like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's really where it came from. It was just us wanting to have sort of a weekly check-in for people who wanted to be like, what's going on with Flesh and Blood this week? Because there's usually always something.
Yeah.
Sometimes we do that. Sometimes we just ramble on about random stuff.
Being experienced content creators, does it feel like a natural fit for the three of you to do this podcast?
Sort of. I can't necessarily speak to Kellen as specifically. They're really good at keeping up sort of conversational back and forths and stuff. I sort of as a little bit like outing myself a little bit. I am not a podcast person. Like I don't consume podcasts as a form of media.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that it's just something that the way that we approach it is we basically at some point Kel hits record once we're all on a call, and then we talk for a little bit, and then Az goes, "Are we live?" And that's it. And then we just like talk about, we have usually like a set of bullet points of things we want to talk about. And then we just kind of go until it's done. So the way that we approach it isn't necessarily as content. It's sort of, we are talking, and as a result, that becomes content.
Yeah. That was a spot on impression. It was so good.
I mean, I talk to the man every week. So it's that and lovely old job.
Yeah. It sounds so natural when you are talking, and I guess that's why, because it's just a conversation that you happen to record, right?
Yeah. It's it ends up being, I don't know. We just always have decent topics to talk about because I mean, like I said, there's always something happening in Flesh and Blood, and we're all sort of interacting with it in a slightly different way. Az is very like on the ground and grassroots and interacting with the community there. Kel obviously has a much bigger audience, so he's juggling that plus other stuff. And then myself, like I personally, I am part of a lot of content, but I do not personally create a lot of content. So it's more of a like a theoretical thing for me, at least from a content creation standpoint, but it's still fun, and it's still nice to just be able to talk about stuff and to theory craft and to speculate. That's where I find the most joy.
To keep with that thought, what keeps you going on week after week to make content on multiple platforms?
It's mostly like I said, like we basically just record our regular conversations. So when we're having discussions with each other, it's because we just want to talk about Flesh and Blood. We just have an excuse to start up a call every week and and just start talking about things that have happened. And what do you think about, this spoiler, and what are the implications of this? Did you read the latest lore article? Like such and such a thing happened, or like there's a new shakeup in the meta, and I think that's cool because a previously unplayable deck is now playable. So yeah, it's really just sort of a way for me personally as well to keep myself accountable with things that happen, because personally, and we actually did an episode about this recently, but I've been going through a little bit of an ebb and flow when it comes to burnout and interaction with the game, but keeping part of the Living Legends podcast makes sure that I don't slip too far, and that I'm able to continue to keep up, so that when I do get that that sort of spark to come back, that I'm not just totally lost.
So being an experienced content creator, do you have any tips that you can share with anybody, like even us or somebody else that might be considering starting up their own content?
Absolutely. This is pretty, I would say it's pretty common advice to give, but I also, from my own experience, can say that it is like the most important thing to do with content is just make your content. And that sounds super dumb, but there are always people that'll be like, oh, I got to wait until I get a good camera. I got to wait until I get a good microphone. I got to whatever. Do the best that you can with what you currently have, and just keep making content that speaks to you. Because, you could try to make your content look the absolute best, but from, again, personal experience, you can have the best microphone, you can have the best camera, and if you don't know how to use them, they're garbage. Like it is not worth your time. We started the Spike Feeders with, it was a crappy, I think it was like a $60 DSLR that my brother had found. He taped it to the lights above his kitchen table. And then we had a series of 2x4s that he had nailed together that had a Snowball Yeti microphone suspended from it with wire. And that was it. We just decided to start making content. So yeah, make your content, make sure the content that you're making is something that you're interested in as well. I know I just said that I don't personally consume podcasts, but it's the type of information that I prefer. It is like long form content that goes into some amount of detail, usually like closer to a deep dive than normal. But yeah, if you're making content that you yourself don't appreciate, then your heart won't be in it, and people will be able to notice. So yeah, that's kind of the biggest piece of advice that I can give personally. Makes
sense. Moving into some of the final points of this topic, or sorry, this podcast, we're getting up to an hour and 20 minutes here. Do you have a personal favorite moment in Flesh and Blood so far, whether it be playing or judging or any experience?
That's a good question, actually.
I mean, you didn't have this information beforehand, so I know it's kind of catching you off guard.
No, I Felix did share this with me before, and I did look through it, but
it's a lot.
But yeah,
it is, because you've been playing for what, 1.5 to 2 years, yeah,
there's a lot to pull from. Honestly, I would say one of the most interesting things that has happened to me personally is like I was sort of mentioning, where people get drawn to their own sort of deck or their own hero, was me sort of making the realization that I could make I have a stupid aggro prism deck that I love talking about. I don't know if either of you are familiar with it, but it's based around using Transmogrify to pump up random things and turn them into illusionist cards.
Yep.
It was a really interesting moment for me when I realized that instead of just pulling from a deck that had been, iterated on and theory crafted to death, and like, this is the optimal build, or this is, the most optimal, and then these are the things that people are trying out. Instead, I was just like, I want to attack with Snatch with Go Again.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was just like, and how do I do that? And I was like, okay, well, I can play Prism. I can play it with Luminaris. If I transmogrify, then play a blue snatch, it attacks in for 7 or 8 with go again, and then I can play fractal replication to do it again, and just like do dumb stuff and like put that all together. And the deck is not good, but it is a notorious round 1 killer, because I'm just able to basically murk whoever I'm against round 1 and then immediately get paired into a Guardian and lose.
Yeah.
And then just I just keep losing forever.
That's awesome.
But yeah, just games where I'm able to play with that deck and have that go off, that to me is just super satisfying, because it's an idea that I had, at least as far as I know. There weren't really any deck lists that were posted because it's not the optimal thing, but it was something that I was able to put time and effort into and see basically about as much success as I can expect out of it. And that just feels really gratifying, just like a personal sort of achievement to have something, an idea, and have it realized within the game. Yeah.
We were trying to do the same thing here with Overload. So good, like a dominated go again. Yeah.
Yeah, I have, I think only yellows currently in my list. I think I was playing with blues at one point, but the fact that they block for 2 like really is not good for that deck.
Yeah.
I was so excited when Spectral Prowler came out because it just fits in the 0 cost attack slot, but it blocks for 3.
Yeah.
Hell yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Bill, for joining us here on the IP2 podcast. Could you let our listeners know where people could find you online?
Absolutely. And once again, thanks for having me. This was a fantastic conversation with you both.
Yeah.
I am Bill from the Spike Feeders. You can find me on Twitter at BillTSF, and you can also find me on YouTube at the Spike Feeders FAB. We do live edited gameplay content, so if that's something that interests you, you should definitely go check us out.
Thank you so much, and thank you for joining us on the IP2 podcast. Please find us on YouTube at IP2 Podcast, on Twitter at IP2 Podcast, and on Mastodon at IP2 Podcast at wraith.social. Thank you. Yeah, and I interrupted Shea, and now I completely lost my train of thought. Give me a sec.
So while you gather that train of thought.
Yeah. Hang on, sorry, my cat might start making some noise.
It's all good. My cat walks across my mic half the time.
Yeah. He might just start digging in his box, and I don't want that to interrupt me. Well, maybe not. Okay. Yeah.
I think, sorry, I was going to say, as Prism players, both Felix and I think we've probably looked at a deck similar, not to interrupt, but go ahead and finish the rest of your story.
Oh, absolutely.